Okay, you survived my speed summary. Now we need to talk about what makes Ulysses so weird, why it's still so relevant today, and why this book changed the course of history. Let's start with what makes Ulysses so weird. First, there are these long sections of stream of consciousness. That means we hear a character's thoughts directly. No filtering through another character or narrator. All the thoughts, feelings, and associations just come pouring out. And that's what makes it so crazy. It feels like you're actually inside someone's head. Second, there's this thing called interior monologue. Basically, we can hear a character thinking things without them actually saying them out loud. We see their memories and reactions. And because we're listening to what's happening on the inside, not just the outside, we get to understand them much better. Like we know what's making them happy or sad, even if they're hiding it. Third, the language changes depending on who's talking. For instance, Stephen talks in this highly intellectual, sometimes poetic way, while Bloom speaks more like an everyday person. This helps us distinguish between the two. And it also shows how people express themselves differently based on who they are. Fourth, Joyce plays around with puns and words that sound similar. It's all about creating these little word tricks. And he loves to use words that have multiple meanings. So pay attention to those. They often hide little jokes that make you think twice about what you've just read. Fifth, he mixes high culture with low culture. Bloom, the character, isn't much of a fancy intellectual, but suddenly, Joyce will switch to this really poetic style when describing Bloom's thoughts. By mixing these two styles, Joyce is telling us that everyday life can be just as profound and moving as any high art form. Lastly, remember how I mentioned Ulysses was banned? Well, the reason for that is another thing that makes it weird. Joyce writes about sex, desire, and even masturbation. And back in the early 1900s, that was super scandalous. The novel pushes the boundaries of what can be talked about in literature. It's like Joyce wanted to see how much he could push people and authorities by showing everyday people having real desires and engaging in real activities, including sexual ones. Now, let's talk about why Ulysses is still so important. Today, people sometimes call Ulysses the greatest novel ever written. Now, I know that's a bold statement, but let me tell you why. First, it revolutionized how we write novels. Before Ulysses, stories had narrators who told the story in a pretty straightforward way. Characters were well described, and the plot moved forward step by step. But Joyce turned all of that around. With Ulysses, he showed writers a whole new world of possibilities. He opened the door to writing from the inside of the characters' minds. He gave writers permission to play around with language and break away from traditional storytelling. In short, Joyce made it cool to explore the inner workings of the human mind. Second, it introduced a new type of hero. Bloom isn't your typical hero. He's not a brave warrior, a wealthy nobleman, or even a charismatic leader. He's an average guy dealing with everyday concerns like work, family, and relationships. In fact, he's rather ordinary, but that's what makes him special. Through Bloom, Joyce celebrates the beauty in the mundane aspects of life. He shows us that heroism doesn't come from grand actions, but from how we handle the little things in life. Third, Ulysses is still relevant because it reflects universal human experiences. You might not live in Dublin in the 1900s, but the feelings that drive the characters, love, loss, joy, fear, hope, are timeless. As long as humans exist, these emotions will resonate with readers no matter when and where they're reading. All right, now it's time for the final piece of the puzzle. Why was Ulysses banned? Well, here's the deal. Back in the early 1900s, books faced a couple of challenges when it came to getting published. One big issue was censorship. Authorities didn't want books with swear words, discussions about sex, or anything that made people uncomfortable. Also, there was something called the Postal Act of 1870, which basically said that books with sexual content couldn't be sent through the mail. It might seem shocking today, but back then, people were really conservative when it came to topics like sex and desire. They didn't want them being discussed openly. It was considered inappropriate. Now, Joyce's Ulysses had all sorts of stuff that people didn't want to see in a book, especially for the time period. There was profanity, sexual thoughts, references to sexual organs, even masturbation. These topics were considered gross and shameful back then. They weren't something you openly talked about. Plus, the way Joyce described these things wasn't subtle. He wrote about them very plainly and honestly. This was completely new and shocking. The book was even called obscene and immoral. But you know what? This kind of treatment just made Ulysses more popular. People became curious because of all the hype. They wanted to read something that was supposedly so shocking. They were drawn to the mystery and the idea of something being too much for society to handle. After all, if everyone's saying it's terrible, it must be good, right? This led to an interesting situation. More and more people started reading Ulysses, even though it was banned. Secret societies formed to get the book into people's hands. And when the US banned Ulysses, people saw it as a badge of honor. It was like, oh, Americans don't want us to read this, so it must be awesome. So there you go, my friend. You just journeyed through one of the most unique and influential novels ever written. I know it was a wild ride, but hey, if you stuck with me till the end, you deserve a pat on the back. Seriously, if you made it this far, I'm impressed. And if you found the story fascinating, imagine what it's like to dive into the entire book. It's a whole new level of mind-bending awesomeness. I mean, this video is just the tip of the iceberg. And hey, if you loved it, hit that subscribe button because there's more literary adventures waiting for you. Thanks for joining me on this journey through Ulysses. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and above all, keep reading. Who knows where your next great adventure might take you? Until then, stay curious, stay open-minded, and remember, within these pages lies the power to shape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. See you next time